Hi, my name is Donald Palmer, and I'm a commissioner with the Election Assistance Commission. As a federal clearinghouse on election administration, the EAC is working to provide information and resources for election officials and offering whatever support we can at the federal level to help state and local election officials to administer safe, secure, accessible, and accurate elections. Now, today's video chat is the third in a series focused on supporting new election officials and those who may be experiencing their first presidential, and what to anticipate and prepare for in November. Now, in this series, we will be addressing a number of critical topics, with today's discussion focusing on Election Day and early voting, including allocation of resources, voting machines, the management of voters, and perhaps a very high turnout election, including many of those like provisional ballots. So I'm joined today by my guests, who include Thad Hall from Mercer County, Pennsylvania, the Director of Elections, Olivia McCall, Wake County, North Carolina Elections Director, and Amanda Seyfang, Bradford County, Florida Supervisor of Elections. Welcome, you all.
Hi.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started, let's just introduce yourselves, a quick bio and a little bit about the county that you're administering elections, and then we'll get started with some of the Q&A. Let's start with that.
Well, I'm Thad Hall. I'm the Elections Director in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. We're a county with 74,000 registered voters with 91 precincts. I came here in 2020. Before that, I was in Coconino County, Arizona. Before that, I was in Richland County, South Carolina. And before that, I did election consulting. And so I've been involved in elections for quite a while.
Thank you, Thad. Olivia.
Hi, I'm Olivia McCall. I am here in North Carolina in Wake County. We actually make up a little over 11% of the voter population in our state of North Carolina. We have right now over 830,000 registered voters. We have 212 precincts. We just got approved with our new budget to split 5, which we're very grateful for. Growth is hitting everywhere. I'm sure that everybody on this call can agree. So I started in elections during a presidential. 2008 was my first election, and I never got out. I've been in elections since 2008. I actually started in Wake County, and then in 2011, I moved to Cabarrus County, where I was deputy director there for 5 years, and then had an opportunity to come back to Wake County as their business officer, and then moved into the deputy director position. And then just a year ago, I became director of Wake County.
Great. Amanda.
Hi, my name is Amanda Seyfang. I'm the supervisor in Bradford County, Florida, Sunshine State. We are a small county. We only have 18,000 registered voters, thereabouts, 13 precincts, only 12 locations. So it makes my setup and breakdown a little bit easier than some of you larger counties. I've been in elections it's almost been the only job I've ever had. I started right out of high school working in the office here in Bradford County as just a part-time helper. And then after college, just kind of fell in love with it and ran and was elected in 2020 for the Supervisor of Elections position.
So great. Welcome aboard. Let's talk a little bit about the important differences election officials will need to know about preparing for a presidential election compared to other types of elections, such as a midterm or a local election. And we can start with Olivia. Olivia, how would you prepare for a presidential in general differently than other elections, and what generally should you be aware of?
I think the biggest thing for planning for a presidential, which is different, you've got to take into account that you're going to have a higher voter turnout. So with that, I mean, that sounds so basic, but when you think about it, it affects your staffing levels. It affects, your training schedule. We have to back it out to make sure we train over 2,500 precinct officials to work an election. And that doesn't include our early voting training that we do, which is over 1,000 workers. So to get all of those pushed through and making sure that we have adequate time to train. We also, in North Carolina, we're no stranger to law changes. So we also make sure that, we have a plan in place, and, we work, we have various teams in our office that we make sure we have plans to know what we do when resources are pulled in different directions, where to go, what to ask for. And again, I think for a presidential, we've been planning for this since the last presidential. And I think that's important, even if you're new to elections or if you've been in it a while, just make sure you have everything in place. I fortunately was here in 2020, so I know how we had to scale up for a presidential. I know that there was the unknown factor of the pandemic, and you never know what factor that will be in a presidential election. And each one's unique, but I think the biggest thing is looking at the basics. Make sure you're able to scale up. Make sure that you have a plan in place to be able to change directions to meet those needs. Again, staffing levels, so important to support the turnout. You have to think about ballot length. Typically, in a presidential election, you have more offices that are on the ballot, you have more referendums. We just learned that we have an amendment that's going to be put on the ballot here in North Carolina. So, I mean, it really, that affects how long someone's going to be in the voting booth. So it creates longer lines. And you just have to think of it, how all of these impact, how these, variables impact, your election coming up. And you just have to have a really good plan in place.
So Amanda, coming from the small county perspective, what should election officials be prepared for in a presidential?
I could not agree with Olivia more. We never know exactly what's going to come at us on that day or during those weeks or those months beforehand, but it's always going to be increased compared to your other elections when you're dealing with a presidential. So you have voters who are only voting in presidential elections. So the law changes that have changed in the last 4 years, they're not going to be aware of. Any precinct location changes, polling location changes, they're not going to be aware of. So really your communication about the election as a whole, and then exactly like Olivia said, scaling up all of your support. I was shaking my head in agreement when she mentioned the referendum and amendments in a general election in November. We don't have those in primaries, and those are always going to take up more time in the booth with your voters because very rarely are they fully prepared and understand the language when they first walk into the booth. So keeping in mind that you've got enough resources, enough booths, so you don't have voters just waiting around, waiting to get access to a booth, stuff like that.
So Thad, you've been in a number of counties and presidential situations, just listening to this, it's like you basically got to be able to prepare to maximize your but what advice would you give on the increased workload and the potential?
Right, well, I agree with what they both, said. The two key things, one, what Amanda just said is, this election is going to bring out all of your casual voters. So if you think about the other elections you have, that's bringing out mostly people who are partisans or who care about voting. But this election you'll have so many more people who are, they vote once every 4 years, and they're going to be more likely to call your office and ask questions. And so you also need to think about how you're going to handle the month of October, because the month of October is going to be very busy in everybody's office. You're going to have a higher level of phone calls in places where the parties are targeting people. People are going to be inundated with mail-in ballot applications if they have to apply for one, and that causes all sorts of questions and issues. And then you're going to have more and more people coming into your office to vote in person, whatever kind of in-person early voting you have. And that can pull resources away from other activities that you might have been thinking you're going to do in October. And so you really need to think about, the scheduling issues. So, to go back, to what the Wake County director was saying is, I've pushed all of my training back to the end of September, the beginning of October, just so I can have all my staff and all of our resources prepared for the influx of people who are going to vote by mail on election day. Before election day, because it's just going to be so busy.
So that's basically the October surprise, is that it's going to be busier than you think.
It is, and you're going to get so many more phone calls in your office, and it's going to And it just brings out people who don't know how the process works. And so you get so many more questions and calls.
So given the potential for this elevated turnout, what strategies would you recommend to handle the increased resource demands, both voting systems or electronic poll books or voting booths, as you mentioned? How would you approach that from a strategy? And Olivia, let's start with you at the large county, and then we'll go around the clock here.
Sure. So are you talking about preparing for the turnout?
Yes, it's sort of resource driven. Like, do we have enough machines in this polling place? Do we have enough polling places?
Yes. So I mean, here in Wake County, honestly, we are ahead of the growth. We always are kind of on a 5-year business plan looking at, okay, where are we going to be? What do we need? So we start this process way in advance to make sure that I mentioned we have precincts that are going to be split after this year. That's been in the works, for 2 years, trying to identify that. But I think the biggest, how we navigate through that is making sure that you have your contacts in place, make sure that you have your budget secured, make sure that you are, we joke about it, but we plan for a hurricane, hope for a rainstorm, and if you get lucky, you'll have a sunny day. So we always kind of go by that anyway, to make sure that, so if we always have backup plans. So if we are going to send out X amount of machines, we have X amount that are on, that have been LNA'd, tested, and ready to go out in the event that one goes down. So anything we plan for extra to be ready. We don't order X amount of ballots of how many registered voters we have. We would double, I mean, it's because you have to think of the worst case scenario and what you're experiencing, because like Thad said, in October, you're going to be slammed. You're not going to have time to make these plans. You're not going to have time to get these resources together. And a lot of times it takes months in advance to create those relationships and to make sure that you do have the budget, funding from the source that you need it from. So, and I'm not sure how other states get funding, but for us, we work with our county, and our county commissioners do approve the funding that we can use. So we're always making sure that, leading up to a presidential, we have all of that in place to ensure that there's a backup plan and we have the resources available to us.
So Amanda, I'm going to go to you next, but one of the issues that I've seen is there'll be an allocation of resources and it's slightly off. Perhaps it's demographic changes, or just maybe more inactive voters, or just a lot more voters in a particular precinct for whatever reason. It's a new area. How do you prepare for that? And how do you sort of study those changes in your county to be prepared on a presidential election where a small change may turn into be a big problem?
Yeah, that's a great question, Don. And especially for the new supervisors going through it, don't underestimate the value of historical data. So look to see what your voter turnout has been in all avenues of voting: election day turnout, absentee or vote by mail if you have it in your state, early voting if you have it in your state, what the trend has been. I know from my experience in Florida, being in elections for over 20 years now, you really can start to develop and start to see a trend. Of course, things will happen and that will change. 2020, obviously vote by mail and absentee increased tremendously. And it'll be interesting to see this general election, this presidential year, if it decreases because of the lack of pandemic, going on right now. But one thing Olivia mentioned that I would just like to reiterate, especially for new supervisors, if you can imagine something happening, you should start to plan for that to happen, and as early as possible. I know one of the things that kind of I took for granted was our vendors. I think that they're my vendor and they're available to me whenever I need them, but they're also vendors for not only other election offices in my state, but also across the country, and they're all being bombarded at the same time usually. So keep that in mind. The earlier, the better that you can start planning for these things. In our industry, it's never a bad idea to have too much, but you just never want to run out.
That's a good point. Now, Thad, 2 points could you comment on? One was when you have an allocation of voting systems or poll books, one of the issues I've seen is that all your materials or all your resources are already allocated. And so Olivia mentioned having backup and so you could respond. One of the situations, I won't name the county, but they had no more poll books to deploy and they had issues. And so therefore you can see once the lines start to be created, there are no more poll books to alleviate the situation. Could you comment on the preparation for that? And one of the issues that I've seen is demographics where voters, for whatever reason, who haven't voted in a while, a large number of inactives, suddenly they show up on the other side of the county and one of your precincts is getting swamped with voters, but they're not in that precinct. How would you prepare for those type of challenges?
Sure. Well, I think, Olivia made the key point, which is to make sure that you're communicating all of this with your board of elections, or your county commissioners, whoever the people are who allocate resources, because, this is the election where you need to explain to them that you need to have all the extra resources for the election. The point that she made about ordering ballots. I mean, I order over 100% of ballots for every precinct because I don't want to run out of anything. We hire extra poll workers for every precinct for this election because I want to make sure that I don't ever run short. So if I do have that situation arise where I have more people showing up in a precinct, I'm staffed for that and I have ballots for that. The other point I would make too, this is Amanda, I'm sure, is the expert on this, that she's in Florida and she has to think about hurricanes all the time. But you want to make sure you have enough provisional balloting materials and all of that, because if you have a polling place that gets shut down because of an event, it could be like a bomb scare or something like that, and you have to extend the hours of that polling place, you're required to have those people vote a provisional ballot. And so you just need to be under federal law. So you need to make sure that you're prepared for all of those types of things. And, if something can go wrong, this is the election where it will go wrong, and you do not want to be in the paper. You want to be, make sure that you have a response to these things. And it's, one of the things that I always communicate with my board of elections is that you have a choice. We can spend $5,000, or you can potentially be a front page story in USA Today the day after the election. Which would you prefer? And, you need to, point these things out in, those types of terms, because you're absolutely right. You have to have the resources that you can deploy and move around on election day. And it's a lot easier just to overstaff and have more resources in place. So if you do have a shift in the number of if you do have a lot of inactive voters show up somewhere, you're prepared for that. And like they both said, you should have extra poll books, extra everything, so that you can handle any situation that arises.
Yeah, I think that I know I've heard of counties that will keep a number of voting systems that have been programmed ready to be deployed if necessary. Some will even put them on vans or trucks, and they'll be driving around the county waiting for an issue to occur so they can respond. So I know it's a big issue because the voting machines might come down, poll books might go down, and then it's the goal is to try to make sure that those additional resources can get out to the polling place or early voting site. Is there anything else, just listening to this conversation before we move on to the next topic about, preparing, allocating resources, preparing for early voting or election day?
Don, I would just like to state not only resources in the events of, we're talking equipment, tabulators, or ballots, but also your materials that you may take for granted. Like I know our our clerk's notebooks are the information and guidelines and checklists that we provide to our poll workers. We always have backups of those in case something happens, one gets destroyed, somebody takes one home and it gets lost. So just small things like that, to have those reports or guides or backups ready to go in case somebody needs one.
And
one thing, just go ahead, Olivia.
Yeah, just honestly to add to what Amanda was saying, and kind of what you mentioned, we we use coordinators. So we have zones. We have 212 precincts, and they rove throughout the county. And they have those things like Amanda mentioned. They have backup a signage packet. They have backup ballots. They have everything that you could possibly think that maybe we forgot to pack or something, it got damaged, or so they're able to step in, and they're closer to them than us where we're centrally located. So that's a really best practice, is, to make sure that not only do you have the resources, but know how you're going to get them from point A to B in the event that it's needed. So have a plan together for that as well.
Yeah, having those rovers that are out in the field who have all the materials they need, and they may have a backup machine or something like that. It's critical because, you need to be able to respond to any kind of issue, as soon as you possibly can. And having those resources out is going to make that a lot quicker.
Do you usually keep a technician with those folks to try to repair or get the voting machine working again?
I know here in Wake County, we have a team of techs that are trained to swap out, a piece of equipment if needed. We also, again, I don't know what equipment everybody uses, but we have an emergency bin situation, like where if power went out, or if the machine was not accepting ballots for some reason, we would be able to use that emergency bin until we could get a solution out there quickly.
So before we move on, I just want to make one comment for you to expound on if there's any explanation or comment. One of the things I saw in election offices is, for example, an office might hire one person to process mail or absentee ballot issues over the course of the year. Well, what happens in a presidential year is that the requests are like fivefold, fourfold, right? And so that one person can't handle that. And there's some delays in the response for the mail ballot to get out to the individual. And so that's one thing that I think offices can prepare for, is your internal resources need to be, sort of upped, because there's going to be a lot more volume. And I think that you mentioned that in your one of your comments, is that there's just going to be a lot more requests for all types of things. So let's move on to, we're going to move on to the next issue. And Olivia, how are you preparing the public and the media for what is about to happen, which is, we have elections all the time, but this is a presidential and it's different. There's just a lot more going on. How are you preparing the media?
So one thing that we've put in place is a media kit. I think that it's a great resource. We kind of get ahead of it. The biggest thing is you're going to get bombarded with calls at the time where you don't have time to take the calls from media. So go ahead and designate a spokesperson, or work with you. We have a county communications department that we usually can get help from as well, just to kind of field the calls, or hey, schedule interviews, that type of resource. But as far as like preparing the public, we really rely a lot on social media. But the media kit has been so successful because it's grown. We put historical stats in there. We put important timelines. We have 22 early voting sites, which is the most early voting sites that we've ever had here in Wake County. But we have all of those locations where photo ops would be best. So all the questions that we think they're going to ask, we try to hit them ahead of time. And then it's nice because we can say, hey, when we get those questions, we just send them the media kit, and then that way they're able to get all of the information that they need. And of course, sometimes they want an interview that's a little bit different, but anything you can prepare them with ahead of time, give them information on your security, measures, give them information about equipment as far as like what we use, what to expect. We do not modem in results. It's going to be a late night. You're not going to see results, trickle. It's going to be trickling in, but it's not going to trickle in until we get all those results back to our office, because we're not connected. So I think just making sure that hitting it up front, making sure that they know all of that, and then have some type of document ready to send them, because it really does take a lot of time to field media inquiries. As far as preparing the public, Again, social media has seemed to be really good for us. We have, Facebook, X, and we also do Instagram stories, anything that we can kind of push out that way. One of the other ways that we connect with the public, I don't know if other states have this, but the Nextdoor app, we work with our communications department. It seems like everybody's on that app. We can actually push out important information that way as well. And that seems to be well received and gets kind of a wider net out into your community. But that's really kind of the way that we're handling the media. But that media kit has been so essential for us, and it saved so much time. And it's a great reference actually for your staff too, to be able to answer questions and so forth.
So Thad, just on this sort of thinking about preparing the public and the media, with the fast news cycle, what are some of the strategies that you are thinking about for emerging issues or things that might sort of occur on election day? Let's take long lines, for example, that occasionally occurs.
Well, I think, the key thing is to make sure that you have all the media contacts that you need, that you have those people on a piece of paper in front of you, because if you can't get your computer, you just need to have those people programmed into your cell phone so that you can make, those key phone calls. I have the advantage or disadvantage of being on the border of Ohio. And so my major media market is actually Youngstown, Ohio. And so I have to be very careful about how I communicate out information. But I do, we do a lot with our local newspapers here where we are, to try to communicate information out to them. And they're very good about being non-adversarial in many ways about what we're doing. And I think, if you're an election director in a smaller jurisdiction, you're going to have, you should be cultivating and taking advantage of those local news contacts, because they are going to be a little less confrontational than Olivia might face in Wake County, where, they're going to be, they all want to move up in the hierarchy of news. And also, being able to reach out to those television reporters so that they can report out things at noon or at 5 and 6 is going to be really critical as well.
So Amanda, I can imagine, with early voting, there's a lot of voter education, but, in a smaller county, how is your county going to prepare for, how should a county prepare for a presidential election where there are going to be a lot of new voters or voters who haven't voted in a midterm or one of the local elections?
Yeah, Dawn. So we just do a lot of proactive communications. We, just like Thad mentioned, we have a local newspaper here. So we have a great relationship with them, and we push out any sort of changes. We make sure we direct them to our social media. That's always the easiest, quickest way to get the information and get it from a trusted source, and not just doing a Google search for the county's elections office and where you might just get random hits. So we've done that. We do countywide mail outs. As a small county, we're able to do that ourselves. So we recently went through redistricting, where we've restructured some of our polling locations. So we've done 2 mail outs for that already. And again, just pushing. And I mean, we hammer our social media. We make sure we're posting, if not every day, every other day, on how to be election ready for 2024.
So let's move to the next topic, and we'll stick with you for now, Amanda. So election day is one option in voting. How are you preparing for, and how should you prepare for early or mail voting in a small county? What's some advice that you would give others?
Yeah, so we call our election day voters our traditionalists. They like to traditionally vote on election day, which is great. We don't care, we're unbiased. We want you to vote. We just want you to vote. But as an administrator, it is very helpful if we can get those votes in earlier instead of waiting till one day. So we really like to push early voting. In Florida, we have early voting up to 2 weeks prior to Election Day. And then, of course, in our state, we call it vote by mail, or you may refer to it as absentee voting in our county. In fact, tomorrow is July 11th is our first day we could mail out our domestic ballots, so we're busy getting those ready. We do a lot of prep on that. We make sure in our county, we actually print all of our ballots in-house, and so we have the ability to print as needed. But we make sure we prep that well ahead of the deadline so we're ready to go. We keep things organized in case there's any changes. That might be a good tip is if you're doing absentee or vote by mail for the first time, go ahead and prep those as early as you can, but keep them in alphabetical order or keep them in precinct order. That way, if you have to switch out, if there's been a name or an address change or a party change, you're able to quickly pull those out efficiently and get those updated before sending out our incorrect ballot. And then early voting, of course, we like to use that for various reasons. Again, keeps voters voting before election day, so you're not getting a bottleneck on that one day. But it also provides training for our poll workers, our election workers. They run our early voting site for us, but we're also close enough that we're able to answer any questions or come over if a situation arises. But it gives them really good hands-on time with voters encountering real-life situations that they would on election day.
So Olivia, in a large county like Wake, when you have early voting, sort of the presentation is starting a lot earlier than election day. And so what's your advice to others on preparing for early voting if they have that, and also the volume of mail voting that you might find in a presidential?
Yeah, I'll talk about early voting first. So we obviously, with 22 sites, there's a lot of communication that happens almost up to a year in advance, seeing if they're available. But let's just say you have all your early voting sites selected, you're ready to move forward. We have 17 days of early voting. One of the biggest thing is, to make sure that you are working on communication with them. We've had situations where we didn't know that there was construction going on. It was supposed to end on this date, but then it went into another week, and then it gets too close to your early voting time, and then we're trying to deliver, get everything set up, and there's just make sure that you eliminate all of that through communication to make sure that you are aware of anything that's upcoming. Your contacts change, and that's one of the biggest things that we've run into with 212 election day polling places, and then with 22 early voting sites. We are constantly trying to communicate to make sure that we have the most up-to-date current information for those facility contacts. So if we need to get up with them for any reason, we have the direct source that we need to go to. And in North Carolina, early voting, it's the board selects the number of sites. So that would be an unknown to us until the board has that meeting and selects the sites. But so some of it's kind of out of our hands. Again, we do all the research. We make sure that they're ADA compliant, they have adequate parking. But again, I think that from an administrative standpoint is making sure you have the communication ready to go, check in often, make sure that all your sites are ready to go, they have everything. Security is a big thing, making sure that you can, with 17 days, we have to make sure that we have a secure place that we can lock up, items that need to remain secure. We have to change locks. We have to know exactly if we have some type of alarm system, we have to make sure that all of that is in place. But again, it's a lot. And we have checklists for every site to go through to ensure that we haven't forgotten one of those minor details that can, stop you on the day that you're trying to start early voting. And we think of early voting as little mini election days. So you think of like election day, it's the big day, but really we're running an election day every day through early voting. It's still you're voting from, the morning to the evening, and you've got, some of the law constraints, are not the same, but it's pretty much running an election day pretty much every day. So, people sometimes don't realize that it's the stress is there. We have to make sure that, if something happens, we have to close the site. We have to have an emergency plan. There's a lot that goes into it. As far as absentee, we had a 500% increase in requests in 2020. Again, that was probably mainly due to the pandemic. We've been watching the trends since then. Again, making sure you know how to scale up. Look at I think Amanda mentioned this, look at your historical stats, know what you're about to deal with, and then say, okay, well, if we do have a percentage increase over what we're expecting, how many people does that equate to? What do we need? Make sure that you work with, your teams in advance. Be upfront, transparent. Hey, you might be working long hours, get their mindset right. Because anything with absentee and early voting can change because you really just don't know which method the voters are going to choose. A lot of times we think it's going to go one way, and then we don't see large turnout for absentee. So, and I think one of the other key things is, we really push early voting here in North Carolina, especially with our county being so large. We can't have 830,000 people showing up on election day to vote. So we really push absentee and early voting to make sure that we, eliminate that strain on the precincts on election day, because growth is a big concern, especially here in Wake County.
So Thad, before I ask your question, I sort of hear early voting is almost like Groundhog Day. It's just another day of voting. And so before Thad, talk to me about a couple of different states and localities you've been in.
Right.
How are you preparing for early voting? And here's a little twist. How are you preparing for those provisional ballots that you might see?
Sure. So let me talk first about the one slight difference. So all three of the states that I worked in, South Carolina, Arizona, and now in Pennsylvania, none of those states have what Amanda and Olivia are referring to as early voting. They have basically over-the-counter absentee voting or mail-in voting. So you come to the counter, you request a ballot. You may have to fill out a form, and then you'll receive the ballot, and you basically vote it like an absentee ballot. And that introduces some key resource issues. One of which is you're going to have to make sure that you have the right number of envelopes and materials at your office or at your those sites that you're using for over what we refer to as over-the-counter voting. You want to make sure you have all the resources you need, and because it can be a bit unsure, you may be a bit unsure how many people are going to turn out. You want to make sure you can talk to your vendor about their ability to provide you with materials quickly, because you may not want to order 5,000 envelopes and materials when you're not, you may only have 2,000 people show up. And so it can be helpful to work with your vendor to see how quickly they could restock you if you wanted to or only order 1,000 of something, and then if you were able to, if you needed more, you could order more, especially for smaller jurisdictions. The other thing you have to keep in mind is, the issue of if you're having people drop off ballots, mail-in ballots, how you're securing those drop-box locations or those drop-off locations, making sure that you're staffed for that, and making sure that you're aware of what can happen. Because, you really have to have a procedure for the chain of custody for all the ballots that are dropped off in your location, and a process for then, scanning them into your system once you bring them back to your office. And on your point about provisional voting, in Pennsylvania, if you receive a mail-in ballot and you then go to the polls, you have to surrender that ballot to vote. If you surrender it, you can vote like a regular voter on election day. But if you don't, you do have to vote a provisional ballot. And we do look at those numbers of ballots returned by precinct to understand, well, what could be my possible provisional voting rate for the election. And so it is something to keep in mind that you do want to think about, well, for those voters who are not casting their mail-in ballot, if there is a procedure where they can go to the polls, how will that affect your provisional voting? And that's a very important thing to take in mind, to keep in mind. And I am curious, Amanda, do you allow drop-offs at various locations, or is it just at your early voting sites, or how do you guys handle that?
For absentee or vote by mail returns?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in Florida, we've got, there's been some law changes around drop boxes returning their ballots. And in a county my size, we couldn't afford to keep up with any outside drop boxes. And so we do have a box in our office that voters can drop them off during our office hours. Obviously, at an early voting site, again, my county, we only have one early voting site. Sorry, Wake County. But we are very small. So we have one site, and there's also a secured box there that they can drop them off of. And that's open, of course, during our early voting hours, which includes the weekends.
And Olivia, do you do the same thing?
We do not have drop boxes. So if you are returning an absentee ballot, you can return it by mail. It can be hand delivered to our office, or it can be returned at an early voting site.
You know, Don, the other thing to keep in mind too is if you're in a courthouse, you need to keep in mind how that may affect the security staffing. So like if you're going to have people come into your office early vote and you're in a courthouse, you have to think about, you know, how that affects the, you know, the security staff. And you may need to talk to your commissioners or the people who are in charge of security for your courthouse about, you know, how having 100 or 200 extra people coming through every day may affect them. You need to think about that as well.
Absolutely. Thad, I'm going to stay with you start this next question, and it's about the calendar and how important it is to have a calendar, an election calendar set out with statutory deadlines and giving you some flexibility on the getting tasks done. What is your thought on that, on the importance and how to develop a calendar leading up to Election Day?
Sure. So basically, you know, one of the things about Pennsylvania, and it's interesting that you picked 3 people from 3 very litigious states. We all get sued a lot. And so, you know, one of the things to keep in mind, you know, if you're an election official anywhere where there are lawsuits, is your calendar may get thrown out. Parts of your calendar can get thrown out the window. So like, for instance, in Pennsylvania, the deadline for certifying candidates on the ballot in a presidential year, it never holds up because there are lawsuits about whether or not, you know, a certain party's presidential candidate should be on the ballot. And so you just have to keep that in mind. And what that means is you need to push whatever you can push into September or earlier. You need to go ahead and do that. So if you can go ahead and pack materials in your precinct ballot bags, for instance, or you can go ahead and, you know, take care of things like that, it's very important to go ahead and get all of those simple things done ahead of time so that when it comes time to do your logic and accuracy testing, when it comes time to, you know, finalize your ballot, get it all proofed, when it comes time to, staff, you know, do your poll workers training and staffing your early voting sites. You know, if you do get crunched on time, you're able to do that because, you know, you do need to build a calendar based off your, you know, your statutory requirements, but you do need to understand that, you know, your calendar may get crunched by lawsuits or other fun things.
Olivia, Amanda, do you have any comments on how, any recommendations on a calendar and the importance of it?
I would just reiterate the importance of a calendar and making sure you're jotting down your deadlines, obviously statutorily, but also planning out when you want to have other tasks around the election finished. And just like Thad said, the earlier you can get anything done, the better. Even if it's something small, you think, oh, I can do that on a weekend or something. If you can get it done and get it finished and off your list, that's one less thing you have to do. I know, especially with small jurisdictions, a county my size, I am a working supervisor in my office. Not that you guys aren't, but I actually have to stuff our bags. I train our election workers. I got our vote by mail ballots packaged up and ready for the mail. I meter the mail. I take it to the post office. So we're doing everything. And then also dealing with the public who just wants to pop in sometimes unannounced. And of course, you've got to be ready for that and helping voters. So yeah, the earlier you can get all of your minuscule tasks done that you may think you've got time later, get them done ahead of time.
So Olivia, what is something that takes more time than expected? Talking about the calendar, what are some things that administrators should be aware of that may not always go as planned?
I will kind of piggyback off of the last question a little bit and segue into this one. Flexibility, you do need to have some type of flexibility towards, so whatever you think it's going to take, add a couple days to it, which really pushes the calendar back more. We start training the end of August, and we'll be training all the way through the start of early voting. So, we've got to make sure that we plan for last minute precinct official drops. Someone's plans right now may change closer to the election. So we have hidden classes, where we have a couple days that we can add classes if needed. So factoring in some flexibility where you can, don't butt it up right next to a deadline. Make sure that, because you don't know what's going to happen. And, we talk about this with staff all the time. It's, whatever you can get done, do it now, because you do not know what's going to happen the next day. You don't know if a law is going to change, or if you get some directive from the State Board of Elections basically saying, hey, you've got to change this form. And for us, we've printed, 1 million of them. So, last minute changes for us often involves a vendor, often involves at least a 2-week lead time. And for us in a larger jurisdiction, it's challenging when you don't add in those flexibilities when you can, because if, I know we've mentioned this before, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. You can't, you have to be prepared for it. And again, I think all of us on this call are no stranger to change, and, being flexible is something that you have to be in elections. But I think one of the biggest things that always seems to take more time than what we plan is audits. There's so many checks and balances that go into what we call canvas, which is 10 days after the election. It's post-election processes where we are auditing, making sure that voter history is in place. It's so important to make sure that everything is accounted for. Audits are complete, and is a very tight turnaround. So, just to your question about what tends to take more time, I feel like we do a lot of audits. We do, as much as we can, but sometimes time doesn't allow for that, additional audit that you wish you had time to do.
Yeah.
So that's probably the one thing I wish we had infinite time on is audits.
So let's shift to preparing for transparency and observers. Are there differences in how each of you prepare for observers in a presidential election? You would think that there's going to be a lot more candidates and organizations that want to observe the election. How are you thinking about that? And let's start with you, Olivia, and then we'll go to Thad and Amanda.
Sure. So observers is one thing that I go to our chief judge training classes, and I talk to them about it, because we're gonna have observers. They're part of the process, and we need to welcome that because it is part of the process. The key word in observer is observe, and that's kind of how I talk to our precinct officials, and I recommend maybe sending an observer expectation list to your parties. Making sure that your observers are also following the laws, and put it back on the parties to share that with their appointed observers. Know your party contacts. So in the event that you get a call from your precinct official saying, hey, this person is interfering with this process, or they're not standing where they need to stand, or they're trying to hear confidential information, whatever the case may be, you have that contact and you're ready to talk to the party. So go ahead and establish that relationship, because I can't think of a time that I haven't had to reach out to a party and just say, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is the law. They have to follow it, and we're going to follow it. And if they can't get on board with that, then we have to ask for them to be removed. But again, the key thing with our precinct officials is, I tell them all the time, I'm like, they are there to observe. They cannot interfere with the process. And again, I don't know other state laws, but there are observer guidelines that they have to follow. And that's always helpful to communicate ahead of time to the party so they know what to train on as well.
I think we used to call them the do's and don'ts in Virginia. Thad, how are you preparing for those?
Well, I can't reiterate enough, how important what Olivia just said about reaching out to your parties is. You need to develop a really good relationship with your political parties so that you can communicate with them, those expectations you have of how observers are going to behave and what you expect from them. And also, if you've had issues with observers in the past, you can let them know who those observers were so that hopefully they can find a different observer in this election. A presidential election does generate a different type of observer. So if you've worked in elections for the last couple of if you've had observers in the last couple of elections, you're going to get a different breed for this election. You're going to get many more election, people who are attorneys who want to observe and things like that. And you just need to be sure that you're preparing your judges or your whoever runs your polling place. You're preparing those people to, be able to make sure that those observers know what their expectations are, what they are and are not allowed to do, and make sure that they're going to contact you if there is any issue, because like Olivia said, you may be on the phone with the party saying, hey, we need you to address this issue. And I'm very fortunate. I have very good relationships with our political party chair people, and if I have a person who gets out of hand, we can, because of that relationship, we're able to contact the party and have that person have that issue addressed very quickly.
Amanda, sorry.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on what they've said. Just my suggestion would be to come up with a plan, have a good plan of action, and be consistent with that plan. Whether it's observers in your office or if it's observers in the polling locations, where your precinct clerks or administrators might be running that or enforcing that. But that way you don't run into that somebody's treating me differently and give them any more ammunition to come back to the office about. But if you come up with a working plan and try it out, test your plan. Going back to your other thing about what takes longer than we anticipate, sometimes that's testing, and sometimes we don't do enough testing because we run into some time constraints. But test your plan, have a crowd of people or 10 people come into your office and see where they can see stations from. So that way you're not having to come up with it on the fly.
So let's shift a little bit to poll workers. Any tips and techniques for training poll workers in a presidential year? And we'll start with you, Olivia, and then we'll go to Amanda. What's different about a presidential, if anything? And how do you support them?
So our precinct officials, we think of them as family. We have some we were looking at how many elections some of our precinct officials have worked. We have 2 that have worked 53 elections. So one of the biggest thing I think that, administrators can do is make sure that they feel supported. A lot of times it's, if they're working early voting or if they're working in the office or if they're working election day, and when we're talking about precinct officials, I'm gearing that towards election day, early voting. Making sure that you have a helpline in place, make sure that they have an outlet, make sure that they know who to call in the event of, make sure that they know when to call and not to engage. I think that for us, the biggest thing is we want seasoned workers to come back and work for us over and over again, because they know the process is better. We can, laws do change. That's why we have training before every election. But the biggest thing for us is we want to make sure that they feel comfortable coming back. They feel supported. They know their resources and that we provide them with the right resources. One thing that has helped with Wake County, we are large. We have 2,500 plus precinct officials that we have to train for each election. With that, how do you reach them? How do they learn? How do they, you've got a lot of different varying, variables to work with about how people learn. So we offer in-person training. We offer interactive computer training. We offer Zoom classes, and some people don't want to do any of that. They just want to come in person, and that's fine. Or they just, they're busy working and they don't have time to come to our classes. And so we try to make sure that we offer as many opportunities as we can. And we just just this year we implemented Flipbooks, which is basically an interactive manual that we're able to embed videos. We can look at stats. We actually now know what our precinct officials are interested in our manuals, like what page are they interested in the most, because we can see stats. So that just would be my advice, is to kind of look for feedback from them. What can how do you keep them engaged? How do you keep up with the times?
Mm.
Like I said, some of our precinct officials have been with us for decades, so you know, they don't want to come to the same training every time. And we start out, you know, make sure that if you're bringing old documentation to our trainings, you throw it out. We're starting new. And I think that that's really important too, for them to realize that things do change, laws do change. So just because you worked one election doesn't mean that, you know what's coming up in the next election. But that would be just my advice, is really figure out a way to reach the different the different types of learning you know, environments that people need.
Amanda, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I just like Olivia, our election workers, they're our family. You know, we start our meetings with, you know, welcome to our family reunion. And I think that reinforces the idea that we're all in this together. And so you're also connecting with them on an emotional level, which gets them emotionally invested.
Do you have to train more for the presidential, and how do you motivate them? You know, this could be a long day. And so I guess my question is, in a presidential, are you training more just in case?
We do train extra election workers, again, just for redundancy, like we've talked about how to be prepared for an election in general. As far as the long day goes, we just try to keep them, we're very positive in our training, and in our early voting, we get to see them again. We reinforce that family aspect. We also provide them with great services and support, so they have access to all of our phone numbers. So we make sure they can reach us and get a real person instead of a phone tree. We've actually started implementing care packages. So we give them, we call them election day supply packets, where it's got Tylenol, air freshener, candy, anything, cough drops, stuff like that they may need throughout the day. And of course, probably the thing they like the most is the handwritten note. So we always write a handwritten note for them, and they really seem to appreciate that.
That anything on the poll worker training?
Well, you know, the one thing I would say is, you know, it is such a busy election that, you know, a lot of times the poll workers we have, especially in a more rural place where everybody knows everybody, is to remind them that this is not the election to chat to people with. You know, you can end up with a long line just because people are being a little chatty. And it's important to remember, you know, to remind them to focus on that. But I think that, you know, you know, you need to treat this, you know, like any other training, and just, you know, be sure that you're being positive and motivating them, and you're making sure that they have all the checklists that they need so that they can answer questions quickly. And when they do run into these weird situations, because you know, for instance, as you brought up at the outset, they are more likely, for instance, to be inactive voters. And so for them to understand exactly how do you process somebody who's in that situation, you know, what do they have to show, if they have to show any kind of documentation, you know, you want to make sure that you're preparing them for all of those casual voters who are going to show up on election day, or are going to have questions.
So Amanda, you know, how are you maintaining chain of custody and audit trail in order to be prepared for post-election? How are you preparing for that during the election itself?
Yeah, so you start thinking about that at the very beginning. Like you said, when you start your planning for the election, we make sure any piece of equipment, there's going to be a seal attached to that after it's been touched, and there's going to be a count of that. We've got all these audit trails out that we've got to do, and observers want to see a lot of our trails and the chain of custody forms. And so we just make sure we do that. And again, that reinforces in us the confidence that nobody else outside of us had access to anything as well. So I think not being afraid of it, first of all, and then not taking it for granted, not thinking, well, I'm the only one, so I don't need to worry about it. I know in a small county, we run into that a lot. I'm the only one touching it, so what do I need to seal it for? Well, it's now for this public perception as well. So keeping all of your materials sealed, keeping a good audit log of that. Ballot accounting forms are always really helpful.
Anything to add on that, in sort of the chain of custody? Is it basically from the logic and accuracy test to election day, you know, we're going to maintain that chain of custody for our post-election process?
Right, and it's just making sure that you have an actual paper document in many cases for everything that you've done. Who did the logic and accuracy test on the machine? You know, what seal number was put on the machine? making sure that you're sending something to the polling place so that the poll workers can check to make sure it was the same seal that they received that was the one that was put on, after logic and accuracy testing was completed. Having them return those seals to you, so if somebody ever asked, you could show them, from start to finish, this is how the machine was sealed. This is the seal that they broke to open the polling place. And this is the seal they put on the machine at the end of the day. You want to be able to show, that process all the way through for the machines, for the ballots, for everything.
So Olivia, you mentioned that there is extensive audits in North Carolina. Do you have any recommendation or anything to add on this?
Honestly, everything that they said we're currently doing here in Wake County. One of the things that we have a best practice is on election night in particular, we have escorts. We have remote sites. We're very large. So we have remote sites where the chief judges come back with their supplies. They're collected, audited. Chain of custody is done there. Again, it's a paper process. We also have a backup, kind of a redundancy of the chain of custody through an electronic process as well. So you kind of have both to look at. But what we implemented is that we actually partner with emergency management, and we actually have escorts that escort from. So the CJ comes back, Chief Judge comes back from the precinct to our remote site. At the remote site, all the custody is handed over to our remote site. And then we have a sheriff escort that escorts it all back to our building on election night. So again, in addition to all the seals that we were talking about and the, everything else to make sure that nothing's been tampered with, we have all of that in place as well. But that's just a best practice that we put in place, and we partner. We talked about having resources and using your resources. We actually partnered with emergency management, and we now use that as a best practice for every election, not just presidentials.
Well, thank you. As we wrap this up, is there any last piece of advice for our listeners on best practices or insight as we head into a presidential election? And we'll just do a round robin. We'll start with that, and we'll just go to Olivia and then Amanda.
Sure. So I think that, just kind of to wrap it up, this will be my 5th presidential election, and I learn something new every time, and you can't do it by yourself. There's no way. You have to rely on your team. You have to make sure that, they know that you have, their front, that they have your back. And I think that it's just so important to build those relationships, because it's really, being in elections is tough. It's tough. Election, officials, if you're, any part of elections, it's very demanding and tight timelines. And so just make sure that you have that support system. I think that that's the biggest thing, other than the things that we've already talked about. Just make sure that you have that trust with your staff, people are trained, and you have a plan in place.
Great. We'll do Amanda, and then we'll do that.
Yeah, I would just, like Olivia said, just making sure that you rely and you know who your resources and what your resources are. And that includes your fellow election workers, not just your staff or your poll workers, but your other county officials, other states. It's been wonderful hearing Olivia and Thad talk about their experience. But I know in Florida, we heavily rely on each other, other election supervisors in the other counties, just to bounce ideas off of, or have you encountered this and how did you handle this? So yeah, I definitely lean on each other.
Great. Thad.
Well, I would definitely reiterate that point. You do want to lean on each other and make sure that you're talking to your colleagues and just picking their brains. And even if it seems like a dumb question to you, go ahead and ask it, and just make sure that you're confirming what what you think is right actually is. Olivia did make me think of something when she was talking about printing out her 1 million flyers, which is, you do want to make sure that you have enough toner, paper, all of that stuff, money on your, you want to make sure that the money on your postage machine is just ramped up, because you may have to send out a postcard on the fly, and you need to have, a couple of $1,000s on your postage machine. You want to make sure that you have all those things in your office, so that if something happens, the county may be closed. You may be there at 8 o'clock at night and you run out of toner. You want to make sure that you have all of that stuff in your office, so that you're ready to go regardless of, what you may encounter. So it's stupid things like that that actually can cause you to have a lot of trauma and pain. So you want to make sure that that you have all the supplies you need, including for all of your equipment, including like your printers and all that. Just make sure that you have all of that stuff, prepped and ready to go.
Well, that's a great way to end this. To avoid pain, have a plan B and C. We're gonna write that one down. I want to thank the panelists for joining me today for this important conversation. Those watching can learn more by checking out the EAC's other resources on communication for election officials. Thank you for watching, and please check out the other video in this series at eac.gov. Thank you all.
Thank you.